Sometimes the greatest bonds form in desperate moments. When life and death hang in balance, that's when you discover what you're truly made of. Silas Boone, a weathered cowboy in his late 50s, never expected helping a struggling she-wolf give birth would change his life forever. In the rugged territory near Bitter Creek, he knelt beside the wild creature when no one else would, guiding her through the painful delivery with gentle hands and steady words. But what happened days later left the entire town speechless. The wolf returned, not alone, but with her entire pack. What they left behind at Silas's door would change everything. But was it a warning from the wild, or something far more profound? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory stretched wide and unforgiving, a land where the sky met earth in a line so sharp it could cut. Out here, a man learned quickly that nature didn't negotiate. You either bent with the wind or you broke against it. Silas Boone had been bending for the better part of 20 years, and the evidence showed in the weathered lines of his face. The permanent squint from too many sunrises watched alone, the way his hands moved with quiet economy, no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish. His homestead sat 3 miles outside what folks generously called Bitter Creek, though calling it a town required considerable imagination. A general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, and a scattering of buildings that served various purposes depending on the day. The land around Silas's place rolled in gentle waves of sage and scrub grass, broken occasionally by rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels keeping watch. To the west, mountains rose blue and distant. To the east, the plains stretched until geography became philosophy. The cabin itself stood modest but solid, one room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace that Silas had built himself, windows that faced south to catch what warmth the winter sun offered. A barn held 2 horses, both getting on in years like their owner. A chicken coop provided eggs. A small corral enclosed a vegetable garden that Silas tended with more success than he cared to admit. A man living alone could survive on very little, he'd learned. The trick was not confusing survival with living. Each morning began the same way. Silas rose before dawn, old habit from years of ranch work that his body refused to forget. He'd build up the fire, put coffee on to boil, and while it heated, he'd step outside to watch the sun climb over the eastern plains. In his palm, he'd hold the pocket watch that had belonged to his father and his father's father before that. The silver casing had gone dull with age and handling, etched with the wear of 3 generations. The watch no longer kept accurate time, hadn't in years, but Silas carried it anyway, a weight in his pocket that felt like memory made solid. He'd flip it open, see the hands frozen at 3:10, and think about all the moments that had stopped mattering when Clara died. Then he'd close it with a soft click, tuck it back into his vest, and get on with the day's work. The horses needed tending first. Rust, a bay gelding with a white blaze, had been with Silas for 12 years. Molly, a dappled grey mare, he'd bought from a widow who couldn't afford to keep her. They nickered when he entered the barn, familiar and comfortable with routine. Silas measured out their grain, checked their water, ran his hands along their flanks to feel for heat or swelling. The quiet morning sounds, horses chewing, birds beginning their day songs, the whisper of wind through the barn boards settled something in him that words never could. After the horses came the chickens, 7 hens and 1 rooster who thought he ruled the world. Silas collected eggs, scattered feed, and spoke to them in the same low, steady voice he used with everything living. "Morning, ladies. You've been busy. That's good. That's real good." By the time the sun cleared the horizon proper, Silas would be back inside, frying eggs and salt pork, soaking hard bread in his coffee to soften it. He ate standing by the window, watching the land wake up. Some mornings he'd see deer moving through the sage, sometimes coyotes. Once a black bear had lumbered past, paying him no mind whatsoever. The wildness didn't bother him. In truth, he preferred it to most human company, not that he avoided people entirely. 3 or 4 times a week, necessity pulled him into Bitter Creek for supplies or odd jobs. He'd shoe horses for folks who couldn't manage it themselves, mend fences, help with difficult carvings. He had a reputation for being good with animals, patient where others were rough, gentle where others forced. Silas Boone's got rough hands but a soft heart, Martha Crenshaw liked to say, and the description had stuck. Martha ran the general store, a wide building that smelled of coffee, leather, and the penny candy she kept in jars for children. She was somewhere in her 60s, round and sturdy as a riverstone, with steel-grey hair she wore in a bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She'd taken it upon herself years ago to look after Silas in small ways, making sure he bought vegetables along with his tobacco, asking after his health, inviting him to church suppers he never attended. "You're too young to be living like a hermit," she'd told him more than once. "I'm 57, Martha." That's not young by any measure. It's young to give up on people, but Silas hadn't given up on people so much as accepted that some kinds of hurt don't heal, they just become part of your landscape. Like the scar on his left hand from a badly set break, or the way his knee ached before rain. You learn to accommodate the pain, build your life around it. Sheriff Tom Riddick understood that better than most. He and Silas had known each other since Silas first drifted into Bitter Creek 20 years back. Both of them younger men then, both carrying burdens they didn't discuss. Tom had a quiet competence about him, wore his authority lightly, and had the good sense not to press Silas about his past. They'd share a drink at the saloon occasionally, play cards in comfortable silence, part ways with a nod. "You staying out of trouble?" Tom would ask. "Define trouble," Silas would answer, and they'd both allow themselves small smiles. Doc Harlan was less patient with Silas's solitary ways. A thin man with nervous hands and sharp eyes, the doctor saw isolation as a symptom needing treatment. "It's not healthy," he'd say, "a man your age living alone. What happens if you take ill?" "Who's there to help?" "I manage," Silas would reply, because what else was there to say? That he'd stopped wanting help. That after Clara and the baby, he'd learned the terrible truth that loving someone meant risking a pain so profound it could hollow you out like wind hollows stone. Clara. Even thinking her name after all these years brought an ache that settled in his chest like an old friend taking up residence. She'd been small and fierce, with dark hair that curled at her temples and a laugh that sounded like water over rocks. They'd met at a barn dance in another territory, another lifetime. She'd been 17 to his 23, and when she'd agreed to marry him, he'd felt like the luckiest man alive. They'd tried to start a ranch together, full of hope and plans. 5 years they'd had. 5 years of working side by side, building something, dreaming about the children they'd raise. When she got pregnant, Silas had walked around grinning like a fool, already building a cradle in his mind, already imagining teaching his son or daughter to ride. The labor had gone wrong. Out here, far from doctors, far from help, these things happened. The baby, a girl, perfect and small, was born silent. Clara bled, and nothing Silas did could stop it. She died holding his hand, telling him not to blame himself, making him promise to keep living. He'd kept that promise, technically. He'd kept breathing, kept moving. He'd sold the ranch he couldn't bear to look at anymore, drifted until he found Bitter Creek, built the small homestead that required only his own hands to maintain. He'd kept living the way a clock keeps running after its purpose has passed. The watch in his pocket proved that. 3 generations of Boones had carried it. Passed it father to son, measuring time's passage, marking moments that mattered. Silas's father had given it to him the day he left home to marry Clara. "Your grandfather carried this through the war," his father had said. "I carried it through drought and hard years. Now it's yours. Time's the one thing we can't make more of, son. Spend it wise." Silas had spent it all right. Spent 15 years frozen at 3:10, the moment Clara's hand went slack in his. The watch had stopped working properly years ago, though Silas couldn't say exactly when. Maybe it understood something he hadn't wanted to admit, The time had stopped mattering the day his family died. Still he carried it. Still he'd take it out each evening and hold it, feeling the weight of continuity, of being part of something larger than his own grief. Lately, though, something had been shifting. He couldn't name it exactly, just a restlessness that visited him in the dark hours before dawn. A sense that life wanted something from him he wasn't giving. He'd catch himself staring at the stopped watch and thinking about his brother James up in Montana. They'd quarreled years ago over nothing that mattered now, and pride had kept them apart. Or maybe it wasn't pride. Maybe it was easier to have no family than to risk losing more. The townsfolk of Bitter Creek didn't know all this history, of course. They knew Silas was private, reliable, good with animals. They knew he'd help if asked, but didn't seek company. Some respected that. Some, like Garrett Bowen, found it suspicious. Garrett owned the largest spread in the area, ran cattle, and carried himself like a man who'd never questioned his right to take up space. He was 10 years younger than Silas, thick through the shoulders, with a mustache he groomed with considerable attention. He had opinions about everything and the volume to share them. "Don't trust a man who prefers animals to people," Garrett had said more than once, loud enough for Silas to hear. Something wrong with him. Silas had never bothered to respond. Men like Garrett measured the world by their own yardstick and found everyone else wanting. No point in arguing. The truth was, Silas did prefer animals to most people. Animals were honest. A horse told you straight if you were being too rough. A dog showed you loyalty without needing explanations. Even wild creatures had an integrity people often lacked. They killed when hungry, not for sport. Fought for territory or mates, not abstractions like pride. He'd seen wolves a few times over the years, usually just glimpses. A shadow moving through distant trees, paw prints in snow, that distinctive howl that raised the hair on your neck and reminded you there were things older than towns and fences. The ranchers hated them, of course. Wolves meant lost calves, lost profit. The territorial government offered bounties. Men hunted them relentlessly, but Silas had never seen the point in hating an animal for doing what its nature demanded. Wolves hunted. That's what they did. Expecting them to choose differently made as much sense as expecting winter not to bring snow. Still, he'd never been close to one, never had reason to be. The wolves kept to the high country mostly, and Silas kept to his homestead and his routines. That was all about to change, though he didn't know it yet. Sitting in his cabin that particular evening, coffee going cold in his cup, Silas had no idea that tomorrow's routine ride would alter the course of his life. He didn't know that an act of mercy awaited him, that a choice made in solitude would ripple outward and touch everything. He just sat, like he did most evenings, watching the light fade from the sky. The watch sat on the table beside him. 3:10, always 3:10. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something wild and distant and calling. In the hills beyond his land, a wolf howled. Then another answered. The sound echoed across the empty spaces, primal and haunting. Silas listened until the last echo faded, then stood to bank the fire for the night. Tomorrow he'd ride into town for supplies. Tomorrow would be routine, except tomorrow everything would change. Morning came clear and cold, the kind of spring day that promised warmth by noon but delivered frost at dawn. Silas saddled Rust, packed light, just saddlebags for supplies and the rifle he always carried, more habit than expectation of needing it. The ride to Bitter Creek followed a well-worn trail, but Silas liked taking the long way when time allowed, looping through the gulch where Bitter Creek itself ran, shallow and quick over smooth stones. The detour added an hour, but offered better scenery and a kind of solitude that even his homestead couldn't provide. Out here, with nothing but sky and sage and the steady rhythm of Rust's hooves, Silas could almost convince himself he was content. They were about halfway through the gulch when Rust's ears pricked forward, then flicked back nervously. The gelding's step faltered. "Easy," Silas murmured, one hand on the horse's neck. He scanned the landscape with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read country for danger. Nothing obvious, no rattlesnakes sunning on rocks, no signs of a cougar. But Russ knew something was off. Then Silas saw it. Beneath a scrub of sage about 50 yards off the trail, something moved. Not much, just a shift of shadow, but enough. He dismounted, ground-tied Rust, and approached on foot with the rifle ready but not raised. As he got closer, his breath caught. A wolf, a she-wolf, and heavily pregnant by the look of her swollen belly. She lay on her side, panting, eyes glazed with pain and exhaustion. Even from 10 feet away, Silas could see the problem. She'd been in labor too long, was too weak, and completely alone. His first instinct was to back away. Wolves were dangerous under the best circumstances. A wolf giving birth, frightened and in pain, could easily see him as a threat to her vulnerable pups. But as he stood there, the wolf's eyes found his. There was no aggression in them, no challenge, just exhaustion and something that looked almost like recognition, as if she knew he might be her only chance. Silas's mind spun through options. Leave her and ride on. Nature would take its course, which likely meant she'd die here with her pups. Or he could try to help, risk getting mauled, and probably fail anyway. Then memory struck him like a physical blow. Clara lying in their bed, the midwife they'd sent for, still miles away. The labor going on too long, Clara's strength fading. The way she'd looked at him, trusting him to do something, anything. His own helplessness. The terrible, crushing weight of watching someone you love slip away. Damn it, Silas whispered. He set the rifle aside. Useless at close range anyway, and he wouldn't shoot her unless she forced him to. From his saddlebag, he pulled the strip of calico fabric he used as a kerchief, once part of a dress his mother had made. He'd carried it for years, a small connection to family left behind. Now he used it to wipe his hands. Though there was no real cleaning them out here, approaching the wolf required every ounce of calm he possessed. Easy now, he said, voice low and steady. I'm going to help you if you'll let me. Just need you to trust me for a little while. The wolf watched him come closer, every muscle tensed, but she didn't snap or growl. Maybe she was too weak. Maybe some instinct told her this strange, two-legged creature meant no harm. Silas would never know for certain. He knelt in the dirt beside her, feeling absurd and terrified, and strangely certain this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Her breathing came in labored pants. He could see one pup partway emerged, stuck. Without help, neither mother nor pup would survive. Okay, he said more to himself than the wolf. Let's see what we can do. His hands, rough from years of ranch work, moved with surprising gentleness. He'd helped birth difficult calves, pulled foals, even assisted with a breech birth goat once. The principle was the same, though the stakes felt impossibly higher. One wrong move, and those teeth could take his hand off. But the wolf lay still, letting him work, her trust absolute or her weakness too great for resistance. The first pup came free after careful manipulation. Small, wet, perfectly formed. Silas cleared its mouth and nose, and after a heart-stopping moment, it took a breath and let out a tiny cry. He placed it near the mother's head. She gave it one exhausted lick. The second pup emerged more easily, but something was wrong. It didn't breathe, didn't move. Stillborn. Silas had seen enough death to recognize it immediately. A wave of old grief threatened to swamp him, his daughter silent and perfect and gone, but he pushed it down. Not now. This wasn't then. He set the stillborn pup aside gently and focused on what could still be saved. The third pup required effort. The mother was fading, her contractions weak. Silas had to help, using knowledge earned through years of animal husbandry and a kind of intuition he couldn't explain. His calico kerchief was soaked with blood and fluid, but finally, the pup slid free. Another male, this one breathing strong. The fourth and last came easier, as if the mother's body had figured out what it needed to do. The smallest of the litter, a little female with grey-silver fur. She mewed weakly, and Silas worried she wouldn't make it. But she started nursing almost immediately when he placed her with her siblings. For a long moment, Silas just knelt there, hands shaking from adrenaline and emotion he couldn't name. The wolf lay with her 3 surviving pups, too exhausted to do more than breathe. Around them, the Wyoming territory carried on, wind in the sage, birds calling, the creek babbling its endless song. as if the small miracle that had just occurred was nothing special. Silas looked at his hands, covered in blood and birth fluid. The calico kerchief was ruined. He'd carried it for 20 years, a connection to his mother, to a gentler time before loss had taught him to wall himself off. Now it was stained with the evidence of life preserved, death acknowledged. He used the last clean corner to wipe his hands as best he could, then stood slowly. His knees protested. He'd been kneeling in dirt for the better part of an hour. The wolf watched him through half-closed eyes. If she understood what he'd done, she gave no sign beyond not tearing his throat out. "You're welcome," Silas said quietly. Then, because it felt right, he added, "Take care of them. They deserve a chance." He retrieved his rifle, mounted Rust, and rode away without looking back. His hands still shook. His heart pounded. Emotions he'd kept locked away for 15 years surged against the walls he'd built, threatening to breach them entirely. By the time he reached Bitter Creek, he'd regained his composure, or at least the appearance of it. He went through the motions, bought flour and coffee and tobacco from Martha, endured her questions about why he looked so pale, made vague noises about the heat and not sleeping well. He avoided the saloon, avoided Tom, avoided everyone who might look too closely and see the cracks forming in his careful isolation. The ride home felt longer than usual. The sun hung low and golden, painting the sage in shades of amber. Silas's mind kept circling back to the wolf, wondering if she'd survived, if the pups were nursing properly, if predators might find them vulnerable. He told himself it didn't matter. He'd done what he could. Nature would take over from here. But even as he thought it, he knew he'd check on them tomorrow, just to be certain. That night, Silas couldn't settle. He paced his small cabin, built up the fire only to let it die down again, made coffee he didn't drink. Finally, he pulled out Clara's letters, the ones she'd written him during their courtship, before they'd married and she'd moved to the ranch. He kept them in an old wooden box, tied with ribbon that had faded from red to pale pink. He didn't open them, hadn't in years, just held the box and thought about how Clara had trusted him completely, how she'd looked at him like he could move mountains if needed. How wrong she'd been about that, but today he'd helped move something. A small mountain, maybe. 3 wolf pups were alive, because he'd chosen to kneel in the dirt and try. The pocket watch sat on the table, hands still frozen. 3:10. The moment time stopped meaning anything, except maybe it did mean something after all. Maybe time wasn't about grand moments, but about small choices made in dusty gulches when no one was watching. Maybe redemption came in forms you didn't expect, with teeth and fur and amber eyes that trusted you not to fail them. Silas finally slept near dawn, and in his dreams he heard howling, not threatening but calling, a sound that spoke of wild places and the bonds formed when you choose mercy over convenience, connection over isolation. Tomorrow he'd check on the wolves. Just to be certain, tomorrow would bring more than he could possibly imagine. 3 days passed in a kind of suspended tension. Silas went through his routines, tending horses, collecting eggs, repairing a section of fence that had come loose. But his mind stayed in that gulch. Every spare hour, he found himself riding back to check on the wolves. The first day they were gone. The den beneath the sage stood empty, just disturbed earth and the faint scent of wild animal. Relief and disappointment tangled in his chest. Relief that the mother had been strong enough to move her pups to safety. Disappointment that he wouldn't see how they fared. He told himself this was for the best. Wild things belonged in the wild, and his involvement should end where it began, with one moment of mercy, nothing more. But the feeling didn't settle. Something had shifted in him, like a door long closed had cracked open, letting light into rooms he'd kept dark for years. On the 4th day, he rode into Bitter Creek for the supplies he'd forgotten to buy properly on his last visit, his mind having been elsewhere. Martha's general store smelled of coffee and leather, familiar and grounding. She stood behind the counter, measuring out cornmeal for a farmer's wife. But her eyes found Silas the moment he walked in. "You look different," she said once the other customer had left. "Same as always," Silas replied, examining a barrel of apples with more attention than they deserved. No, Martha came around the counter, studying him with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Something's changed. Your "I don't know" presents somehow. Like you've been sleepwalking for years and finally woke up. Silas felt heat creep up his neck. You've got quite the imagination, Martha. It's not imagination when it's true. She crossed her arms. Waiting, he could have deflected, changed the subject, retreated behind the walls that usually kept people at a comfortable distance. Instead, he found himself saying, "Helped an animal in distress a few days back. Guess it got me thinking, what kind of animal? Just something that needed help. Not quite a lie, but not the truth either. Admitting he'd helped a wolf would start conversations he wasn't ready to have. The town's opinion on wolves ran hot and hostile, especially with Garrett Bowen fanning the flames at every opportunity. Martha's expression softened. Well, whatever it was, I'm glad. You've got too much kindness in you to keep it locked up forever. She moved to a shelf, took down a jar of honey, the good kind, golden and thick. Take this. For whatever needs tending, I can't, you can, and you will. Consider it payment for all the times you fixed my wagon wheel or carried heavy loads without being asked. She pressed the jar into his hands, warm from the shelf. Everything deserves sweetness sometimes, Silas, even stubborn old cowboys. He accepted it because refusing would have required explanations he didn't have. Thank you, Martha. Outside, the afternoon sun hung bright and hot. Silas stowed the honey carefully in his saddlebag and was preparing to mount when Sheriff Tom Riddick approached, leading his horse and looking troubled. Silas, got a minute? Always do for you, Tom. The sheriff glanced around, making sure they weren't overheard. Had 3 separate ranchers come by this week, reporting wolf activity. Garrett lost a calf, says he saw tracks. Wants me to organize a hunting party. Silas's hand tightened on Rust's reins. Did you see these tracks yourself? Not yet. Planning to ride out tomorrow. Garrett sees what he wants to see. Could have been coyotes, could have been his own neglect. Man loses more calves to bad fencing than predators, but he'd rather blame wolves. Tom nodded slowly. You're not wrong, but if there is a pack nearby, people are going to get nervous. You know how it goes. I know fear makes people do stupid things. It does indeed. Tom studied him with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read people. You haven't seen anything unusual out your way, have you? You're out there more than most. Silas met his gaze steadily. Nothing unusual. True enough. Helping a wolf give birth wasn't usual by any measure, but it hadn't happened on his property. Well, keep your eyes open. And Silas, if you do see wolves, be careful. I know you've got a soft spot for animals, but they're still predators. I'll keep that in mind. They parted with a nod, and Silas rode home with his thoughts churning. The town's hostility toward wolves meant danger for the she-wolf and her pups. If Garrett got his hunting party organized, they'd track them down and kill them without hesitation. The thought sat in his stomach like a stone. What could he do, though? He didn't even know where the wolves had gone. They'd moved on, as wild things do, and the thought stopped mid-formation because Silas had just crested the ridge that looked down on his homestead, and something was wrong. Not wrong exactly, but different. Movement near his porch. His hand went to the rifle instinctively, then relaxed as recognition settled in. The she-wolf stood on his front porch, alert and healthy-looking. Her coat gleamed in the late afternoon light, gray-brown and thick. Behind her, partially hidden in the gathering shadows, glowing eyes marked the rest of the pack. Silas counted quickly, 8 wolves total, all watching his approach with eerie stillness. His heart hammered. Rust sensed his tension and danced sideways, wanting to bolt. Silas held him steady through sheer force of will and years of trust between man and horse. Easy, he murmured. Easy now. He dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate and calm. The wolves didn't react, just watched. The she-wolf's gaze held steady on him, and in it Silas saw intelligence and purpose. This wasn't random. This was intentional. She moved then, and Silas saw what lay at her feet, a small shape, grey-silver fur, barely visible in the dimming light. One of the pups, the smallest one, the female he'd worried wouldn't survive. The she-wolf nudged the pup forward with her nose, then stepped back. The pup mewled, confused and afraid. The wolf looked at Silas, then at the pup, then back at Silas. The message couldn't have been clearer if she'd spoken it aloud. Take her. She's yours now. No, Silas said, barely breathing. You can't, I can't. But the she-wolf was already turning, moving toward the pack, waiting in shadow. She paused once, looked back, and in that look Silas read something that shook him to his core. Trust, gratitude, choice. The pack melted into darkness, as if they'd never been there at all. Silas stood alone in his yard, with a wolf pup at his feet, his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. The pup whimpered, shivering in the cooling air. Without thinking, Silas knelt and scooped her up. She was cold, so small his hands easily held her entire body. Against his chest, he felt her heart beating fast as a bird's wings. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked the empty air. The pup just burrowed against his warmth, instinct driving her to seek safety and heat. Silas stood there as the stars began to emerge. Holding a wolf pup and feeling the last of his carefully maintained isolation crumble like sun-dried clay. Finally, because there was nothing else to do, he carried the pup inside, set her carefully on the floor while he built up the fire. She explored on wobbly legs, sniffing everything, already showing the curiosity that would define wolves. When she started to whimper from cold, Silas grabbed the old wool blanket from his bed, red-striped and faded. The blanket Clara had woven years ago, and wrapped the pup in it. He warmed milk on the stove, remembering Martha's honey, and mixed a little in. The pup lapped it up eagerly, her tiny tail starting to wag. Despite everything, the impossibility, the complications, the sheer insanity of what he was about to attempt, Silas felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest. Hope. Fragile as new grass after winter, but real. He looked at the pup, now curled in Clara's blanket by the fire, already drowsing. "I suppose you need a name," he said. The way the wolves had appeared and disappeared, leaving only this small trace of their presence, reminded him of something. An echo of wildness in a tame place. A memory of freedom given form. Echo, he decided. "Your name is Echo." The pup's ear twitched at the sound, and then she was asleep, safe and warm, and utterly dependent on him. Silas sat down heavily in his chair, reality settling over him. He'd just become responsible for a wolf. Not a dog, not some domesticated creature, but a genuine wild wolf. The town would lose its mind when they found out. Garrett would use it as ammunition. Even Tom might have concerns, but looking at Echo, sleeping peacefully, Silas found he didn't care as much as he should. For the first time in 15 years, something needed him. Not just his labor or his skills, but his care and protection and presence. The wolves had given him a gift beyond measure. The question was whether he had the courage to accept it. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a howl rose and fell. Echo's birth family, calling through the darkness. Inside, the pup slept on, dreaming whatever wolf pups dream. And Silas Boone, sitting in firelight with a miracle wrapped in an old blanket, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, life still had surprises worth living for. The first night passed in fragments. Echo whimpered every few hours, needing warmth or milk or simply reassurance. Silas found himself sleeping in the chair by the fire, the pup nestled in the blanket at his feet. Every time she cried, he woke and tended to her, warming milk, checking that she wasn't too hot or cold, speaking softly until she settled again. By dawn, exhaustion pulled at him, but also something else, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. This small creature depended on him entirely, and that dependency, far from feeling like burden, felt like grace. In the early light, he examined Echo more carefully. Her grey-silver fur was thick and soft, her paws already large in proportion to her body. She'd grow into a substantial animal. Her eyes, barely open, showed flecks of amber. When he held his finger near her mouth, she tried to nurse on it, making little grunting sounds that might have been contentment. "You're going to be trouble," he told her. But I suppose I knew that already. The reality of his decision hit him in stages throughout that first full day. He'd need supplies, proper milk if he could get it, maybe a bottle to make feeding easier. He'd need to wolf-proof the cabin somehow, protect his things and keep her safe. Most challenging, he'd need to figure out how to explain this to town without causing an uproar. By mid-morning, necessity drove him to Bitter Creek. He bundled Echo inside his coat, hoping she'd sleep through the journey. For the first mile she did, warm against his chest. Then she woke and started squirming, curious about the movement and new smells. "Stay quiet," Silas murmured. Just a little longer. Echo, being a wolf pup, had no intention of staying quiet. She yipped and wriggled, and by the time Silas reached the general store, Martha was already waiting on the porch, arms crossed and eyebrow raised. "Silas Boone, what on earth do you have in there?" No point in lying. Martha would find out anyway. The woman had sources of information that defied natural law. He opened his coat enough for her to see. She gasped. "Is that a pup?" he said firmly. "Just a pup who needed help." Martha came closer, peering at Echo with a mixture of wonder and concern. "Silas, that's not a dog. Those markings, those paws. She's a pup who needed help," he repeated more forcefully. "And I'm going to raise her." For a long moment, Martha just looked at him. Then, incredibly, she smiled. "Well, I'll be. You've gone and found yourself something to care about again." "Martha, don't Martha me. I know what I'm seeing. That creature pulled you out of yourself, and I'm not about to question a blessing, even if it's got 4 legs and fur." She patted his arm. "Come on inside. We'll get you what you need." Inside the store, away from prying eyes, Martha helped Silas gather supplies. Bottles meant for feeding orphaned calves, proper milk powder, soft cloths for bedding. She moved with efficient kindness, asking questions about Echo's age and health, offering advice based on raising countless animals over her 60-some years. "You'll want to be careful who you tell about this," she said quietly, while wrapping his purchases. "People get nervous about wolves. She's just a pup. Today she is. In a few months she'll be unmistakably wolf. You prepared for that conversation?" Silas met her eyes. "I'll handle it when it comes." "I believe you will." She handed him the wrapped bundle. "But Silas, be smart. Some folks won't understand. They'll see danger where you see, well, whatever you see in her. What did he see? A second chance, maybe. A way to prove to himself that caring for something vulnerable didn't automatically lead to loss. A creature who needed him without expecting him to be anything other than what he was. "I see something worth protecting," he said finally. Martha's expression softened. "Then protect her well." Outside, Silas nearly collided with Sheriff Riddick, who'd been approaching the store. Tom's eyes went immediately to the bundle in Silas's arms, specifically to Echo's small face, poking out, alert and curious. "Is that a stray?" Silas said. "Found her alone, too young to survive on her own." Tom stepped closer, studying Echo with a lawman's careful attention. Silas's heart pounded. Tom knew animals better than most. If anyone would recognize wolf versus dog, it would be him. "Unusual markings," Tom said finally. "Unusual pup." Their eyes met. Understanding passed between them. Tom knew, or at least suspected, but was choosing not to push. "Not yet. Just remember what I said about wolves being dangerous," Tom said carefully. "Even young ones can be unpredictable. I'll remember." Tom nodded and stepped aside. Silas made it another 10 yards before Garrett Bowen's voice stopped him cold. "What have you got there, Boone?" Garrett stood with 2 of his ranch hands, all of them dusty from riding. His eyes fixed on Echo with immediate suspicion. "A pup," Silas said, keeping his voice level. "Nothing that concerns you. Looks wild to me." "Got the coloring of a mixed breed," Silas interrupted. "Found her abandoned. Raising her myself." Garrett stepped closer and Echo growled, a tiny sound but unmistakably defensive. Garrett's expression hardened. "That's no dog. That's my business, not yours." They stared at each other, tension thick enough to cut. Garrett's hands flexed at his sides, and Silas read the calculation happening behind his eyes. But they were in the middle of town with witnesses, and Garrett was many things, but not quite stupid enough to start something here. "Better keep that thing under control," Garrett said finally. Anything happens to my livestock, I'll hold you responsible. Nothing's going to happen to your livestock. Garrett spat in the dirt and walked away, his men following. But the threat hung in the air like smoke. The ride home felt longer than usual. Echo fussed in his coat, wanting to explore, and Silas's mind churned through everything that had just happened. Word would spread now. By tomorrow, everyone in Bitter Creek would know that Silas Boone was raising something unusual. The questions would intensify. The pressure would build. But back at the homestead, settling Echo into a nest of blankets near the fire, feeding her from the new bottle and watching her lap up milk with growing confidence, Silas found his resolve strengthening. This pup deserved a chance at life. The wolves had trusted him with that responsibility, and he wouldn't betray that trust just because small-minded men chose fear over understanding. That evening, he lit the lamp and pulled out paper and pen, items he rarely used anymore. The letter to his brother had been sitting half-written in his mind for months. Now, with Echo sleeping nearby, he finally put words to page. "James," he wrote, "it's been too long since we spoke. Pride kept us apart, and I regret that. Life's been teaching me lately that isolation isn't the protection I thought it was. Something happened recently that I need to tell you about." He described finding the wolf, helping with the birth, the pack's return. His pen moved faster as the words flowed, years of silence breaking like a dam giving way. He wrote about Clara, about the grief that had hollowed him out, about learning, finally, slowly, that opening yourself to care again meant risking pain but also discovering purpose. "I don't know what I'm doing," he wrote. "But for the first time in 15 years, I'm doing something. And that feels like enough." He signed it, sealed it, and set it on the table. He'd mail it tomorrow. Or maybe he wouldn't. The important part was writing it, admitting to himself that he wanted his family back, wanted connection again. Echo woke and whimpered. Silas picked her up, feeling her solid weight, her warmth, her complete trust. She licked his hand with her small pink tongue and made a sound that was almost a purr. "You're changing everything," he told her. "You know that?" Echo just nuzzled closer, already learning where safety lived. Outside, the night settled over Wyoming with all its vastness and stars. Somewhere out there, Echo's birth pack roamed free, trusting Silas to honor the gift they'd given. Inside, by firelight, a solitary man who'd thought his caring days were over found himself caring with a fierceness that surprised him. The pocket watch sat on the table, hands frozen at 3:10. But Silas didn't check it that night. Time was moving forward again, whether the watch knew it or not. 3 months transformed Echo from a helpless pup into something that could no longer be mistaken for a dog. She'd grown rapidly, her legs lengthening, her chest broadening, her features sharpening into the unmistakable profile of a wolf. Her fur had darkened to a rich grey-silver that caught the light like water, and her amber eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved Silas with its depth. Training her required patience and a fundamental shift in thinking. Echo wasn't a dog, wouldn't respond to dominance or force. She needed respect, consistency, and understanding that her nature ran different currents than domestic animals. Silas approached it like gentling a wild horse, finding the balance between guidance and freedom, between teaching and allowing. Early on, he'd carved a whistle from cedar wood, shaped it during long evenings while Echo played at his feet. The cedar came from a fallen tree near Bitter Creek, the wood red and fragrant. He'd worked it smooth, drilled holes until the tone came clear and distinct, a sound unlike anything else. Carrying far across open country, the first time he blew it, Echo's ears shot up, and she came running from where she'd been investigating a rabbit hole. He rewarded her with dried meat and praise. They practiced daily, gradually increasing distance. Soon Echo would come from a quarter-mile away, bounding through sage with joy, evident in every leap, but she also needed to be Echo, not some wolf-shaped dog following commands blindly. So Silas let her roam, let her hunt small game, let her howl at dusk when the urge took her. Their relationship became a dance of trust rather than control. When he called with the whistle, she came not from obedience, but from choice. That difference mattered. The town's reaction evolved from curious to concerned to outright hostile. Word had spread that Silas Boone was keeping a wolf, and opinions formed along predictable lines. Martha remained supportive, often stopping by with treats or advice. Doc Harlan grumbled about rabies and danger, but grudgingly admitted Echo seemed healthy when Silas brought her in for examination. Sheriff Riddick walked a careful line, making it clear that any aggression from Echo would force his hand, but acknowledging she'd shown none. "You're playing with fire, Silas," he'd said more than once. "People are nervous. People are always nervous about what they don't understand. That doesn't make the fire burn less hot." The real trouble centered on Garrett Bowen and his contingent of ranchers. They'd latched onto Echo as proof of Silas's recklessness, his disregard for community safety, his general untrustworthiness. At the saloon, in the general store, at church, they spread their concerns and stoked fears. The confrontation came to a head at Martha's store on a hot afternoon in late summer. Silas had stopped for supplies with Echo waiting outside, tied to the hitching post. He'd just paid when raised voices drew his attention to the street. Garrett stood with 4 of his men surrounding Echo, the wolf. Still young, but already protective of her territory and pack, which meant Silas, had her hackles raised and teeth showing. Silas pushed through the door. "Back away from her." Garrett turned, face red with heat and anger. "This thing's a menace. She growled at me. You approached her while I wasn't there. She doesn't know you and she's protecting herself. She's a wolf, wild and dangerous. She's mine, and she's threatened no one." Silas moved between Garrett and Echo, feeling her press against his leg, still growling low. He put his hand on her head. "Easy, girl, easy." Echo quieted but remained tense, reading the hostility in every line of Garrett's body. "Something needs to be done," Garrett announced loudly, playing to the gathering crowd. "We've all got livestock families to protect. Can't have a wolf running loose, doesn't matter who owns it. She's not running loose. She's under my control. For how long? What happens when she gets bigger, stronger, when her wild nature kicks in and she goes after cattle or children?" Martha stepped onto her porch. "That's enough, Garrett. Echo's been here 3 months and hasn't caused a moment of trouble. Yet," Garrett shot back. "Hasn't caused trouble yet. But wolves kill. It's their nature." Silas felt his temper rising, but kept his voice level. "Dogs kill, too, when they're poorly raised or mistreated. Echo's neither. She's healthy, well-fed, and knows her boundaries." "Boundaries," Garrett spat the word. "You're a fool, Boone. That thing will turn on you, mark my words. Then it's my risk to take, not when it affects the rest of us." Sheriff Riddick arrived, drawn by the commotion. "All right, everyone settle down." He looked at Echo, still pressed against Silas's leg. "She cause any damage?" "No," Silas said firmly. "She threatened Garrett. She growled when a stranger got too close while her pack was away." "That's instinct, not aggression." Tom considered this, then nodded slowly. "Garrett, step back. Silas, get Echo home. And folks," he raised his voice to address the crowd, "I know there's concern. But concern isn't cause for action. If and when there's actual trouble, I'll handle it. Until then, everyone mind your own business." The crowd dispersed reluctantly, but Garrett lingered, staring at Silas with undisguised hostility. "This isn't over. It never was with you," Silas replied quietly. He untied Echo and walked to where Rust waited. The ride home was tense, Silas's mind working through implications. The town's patience was wearing thin. Garrett wouldn't let this go. The man held grudges like some men held land, tight and protective and unwilling to yield. Back at the homestead, Silas let Echo run free, watching her chase jackrabbits through the sage with fierce joy. She never caught them. They were too fast. But the hunt itself seemed to satisfy something in her. When she tired, she came and flopped at his feet, panting and happy. He sat on the porch step and pulled out the cedar whistle, turning it in his hands. Such a simple thing, really. Carved wood and breath. But it represented everything he'd learned about trust these past months. Echo didn't come to the whistle because she had to. She came because she wanted to, because she'd learned that his call meant something good, safety, food, companionship. That evening he finally gathered the courage to mail the letter to James. rode into town under cover of dusk, slipped it into the mailbag at the general store, rode home before anyone could stop him with questions or concerns. Echo met him at the property line, having heard Rust's hoofbeats from half a mile out. She ran alongside them, playing and leaping, and Silas felt his heart clench with affection that scared him a little. He'd sworn off this kind of attachment, convinced it led only to pain. But watching Echo, seeing her joy and trust and wildness all mixed together, he understood something Clara had tried to tell him before she died. Love wasn't about guarantees or safety. It was about showing up, about choosing connection despite the risk, about being present for another being's journey, however long or short it turned out to be. That night, Echo brought him a rabbit she'd finally caught, her first successful hunt. She laid it at his feet, tail wagging, eyes bright with pride. Silas felt tears prick his eyes, though he couldn't have explained exactly why. "Good girl," he said roughly. "That's very good, Echo." She preened under his praise, then settled beside him on the porch as the stars emerged. In the distance, wolves howled. Echo's ears perked up, listening to voices that called to something deep in her nature. Silas tensed, wondering if she'd answer, if she'd run toward them. But Echo just tilted her head, listening, then settled closer against his leg. She'd heard her family, acknowledged them, but chosen to stay. "Thank you," Silas whispered. Echo's tail thumped once against the wood, far off. The pack howled again, and this time Echo did answer, a long, mournful sound that raised the hair on Silas's arms and reminded him that wildness couldn't be fully tamed, only honored. When she finished, she looked at Silas as if to say, "I can be both. Watch me." And somehow, in that moment, Silas believed it was possible. Winter came early that year, bringing with it shorter days and the kind of cold that settled into bones and stayed there. Silas prepared his homestead carefully, stacking firewood, reinforcing the barn against storms, laying in supplies. Echo, now nearly full-grown, helped in her own way, hunting rabbits and keeping the property clear of smaller predators who might threaten the chickens. Everything might have continued peacefully if not for what happened on a frozen morning in late November. Sheriff Riddick rode up before dawn, his face grim in the pre-light darkness. Silas met him at the door, instantly alert. "Tom didn't make social calls this early. Garrett's prize bull was killed last night," Tom said without preamble. "Found dead near your property line. Throat torn out." Silas's stomach dropped. "And he's blaming Echo." "He's blaming wolves in general, but yes, Echo specifically." Tom dismounted, his breath fogging in the cold air. "I need to see her, Silas. See if there's blood on her. Signs she's been hunting large game. She was here all night. I'd know if she'd gone out. Then showing me proves that." "Fair point." Silas called Echo, who emerged from the barn where she'd been sleeping in the hay with Rust and Molly. Her coat was clean, her paws free of blood. Tom examined her carefully, running his hands through her fur, checking her mouth and claws. "She's clean," he admitted. "But Silas, I need you to come see the kill site. Garrett's insisting it was wolves, and if I can't prove otherwise, he's going to demand action." They rode out together, Echo loping alongside Rust. The kill site lay just beyond Silas's eastern fence line, on open range where cattle often grazed. The bull sprawled in frozen grass, its throat indeed torn out. But as Silas dismounted and knelt to examine it, his experienced eye caught details that didn't fit wolf predation. "The bite pattern's wrong," he said, studying the wounds. "Too wide. Wolves take down prey from behind usually, hamstring them first. This was a frontal attack from something larger." Tom crouched beside him. "Larger how?" "Mountain lion, I'd say. See these claw marks on the shoulders? Cats do that when they jump prey. And the way the flesh is torn, cats have a different jaw structure than wolves. Can you prove that to Garrett?" "I can try, but you know Garrett. He sees what he wants to see." They were proven right within the hour. Garrett arrived with 6 men, all armed, all hostile. He barely glanced at the evidence Silas tried to show him. "Wolf is a wolf," Garrett said flatly. "Your creature's been here long enough to cause trouble, and now trouble's happened. This wasn't Echo. I don't care. A wolf killed my bull, and you brought wolves into this territory. You're responsible, Sheriff Riddick tried to mediate. Silas has evidence this was a mountain lion attack. Evidence he manufactured to protect that thing. Garrett pointed at Echo, who sat at Silas's side, watching the hostile humans with wary eyes. I want it destroyed, now. I'm not destroying her based on your assumptions. Then I'll do it myself. Garrett's hand went to his rifle and everything happened fast. Echo growled, sensing threat. Silas stepped between them. Tom's hand went to his sidearm. Nobody's shooting anybody, Tom said firmly. Garrett, there's a process for this. We gather evidence, present it to the community, make a decision together. I'm not waiting for a process while more of my cattle die. You're not killing this wolf without proof she was involved. The standoff held for a tense moment. Then Garrett seemed to collect himself. Fine, you want proof? Give me 2 weeks. If there's no more attacks, I'll consider that maybe you're right. But if anything else dies, that wolf goes. We vote on it as a town, and I guarantee you won't like the outcome. He rode off with his men, leaving Silas and Tom in the cold morning air with a dead bull between them. You've got 2 weeks, Tom said quietly. Use them to find your mountain lion, or Echo won't survive the vote. Back at the homestead, Silas felt the walls closing in. He'd been given a deadline to prove Echo's innocence, but how did you prove a negative? How did you show what didn't happen while finding what did? He spent the afternoon going through old belongings, looking for anything that might help, reference materials on predator behavior, old maps showing mountain lion territories. In a trunk he hadn't opened in years, his hand closed around something hard and metallic, his father's compass. Silas pulled it out, the brass still bright despite years of storage. He'd forgotten he even had it. His father had given it to him when he'd left home to marry Clara, along with the pocket watch. This'll point you true north, his father had said. But remember, son, true north isn't always the easy direction. Sometimes the right path is the hardest walk. Silas opened the compass, watched the needle swing and settle. North. True and steady, uncomplicated by emotion or opinion. Just fact. He knew what he had to do. The next morning he set out before dawn with Echo at his side. If a mountain lion was hunting in the area, it would have a pattern. A route it traveled, places it bedded down, water sources it used. Finding it meant reading the land, the way his father had taught him, the way years of frontier living had reinforced. They found the first evidence around noon, claw marks on a pine tree trunk. High up where a big cat had sharpened its claws and marked territory. Echo sniffed them, hackles raising slightly, recognizing predator. Easy, Silas murmured. We're tracking, not fighting. They followed a game trail deeper into rocky country, finding more signs. Deer remains cached and half-eaten, classic cat behavior. A scrape in the dirt where the lion had tried to bury waste. Tracks in soft earth near a creek, massive paw prints that made Silas's chest tighten with recognition of just how large this animal was. By late afternoon, they'd tracked the cat to a den area among a tumble of boulders. Silas held Echo back with the whistle, signaling her to stay while he scouted. He could see drag marks, more kill remains. Clear evidence this lion had been hunting successfully for weeks. He was gathering samples, fur caught on branches, clear paw prints in dried mud he could preserve, when a deep cough echoed from the rocks above. Mountain lion warning sound. Silas froze. Echo's ears went flat, and she positioned herself between him and the threat, despite his command to stay back. The cough came again, closer, and then Silas saw it, golden brown and massive. Easily 160 pounds, crouched on a boulder 20 yards away. The lion's tail twitched, eyes locked on them. Calculating, Silas knew better than to run. That would trigger chase instinct. He made himself larger, raising his arms, and started backing away slowly, calling Echo to heel. The lion followed for a few steps, testing them. Then suddenly Echo did something extraordinary. She stood her ground and howled, not an aggressive sound, but a proclamation. A statement of presence and power, the wolf's ancient voice echoing off stone. The mountain lion paused, reconsidering. Two predators, meeting on neutral ground, communicating in ways beyond human understanding. After a moment that felt like hours, the lion turned and disappeared into the rocks. Silas's legs nearly gave out. Echo came to him, pressing against his side, and he buried his hand in her fur, steadying himself. "You just saved us," he whispered. "You know that." Echo licked his hand once, then led the way back down the trail, checking over her shoulder to make sure he followed. By the time they reached home, night had fallen. Silas had his evidence, samples, locations, clear proof of the lion's hunting pattern. Whether it would be enough to convince Garrett and the town was another question entirely. He laid everything out on his table and studied it by lamplight. The compass sat beside the evidence, needle pointing north. True north, the moral direction. He'd found the real killer. Now he had to make people believe him, and he had less than 2 weeks to do it. Echo slept by the fire, exhausted from their long day. Silas watched her chest rise and fall, felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. This wolf had chosen him. Her mother had trusted him with her smallest, most vulnerable pup, and just today, Echo had stood between him and a mountain lion. Protecting him without hesitation, he would not fail her. Whatever it took, he would prove her innocence and keep her safe. The compass gleamed in the firelight. True north, the right path, even if it was the hardest walk. Silas Boone had walked hard paths before. He could walk another. The day before the deadline, Silas found himself unable to settle. He'd presented his evidence to Sheriff Riddick, who'd agreed it was compelling, but warned that town sentiment had turned against Echo. Garrett had been working the community hard, stoking fears and painting Silas as a dangerous eccentric who valued a wild animal over human safety. Tomorrow would be the town meeting. Tomorrow people would vote on Echo's fate. Despite all his evidence, all his careful documentation of the mountain lion's presence, Silas knew the outcome was far from certain. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Garrett had wielded it skillfully, unable to sleep, unable to simply sit and wait. Silas found himself pulling down boxes from the loft, possessions he'd stored away years ago and never quite managed to throw out. Clara's things, mostly. Her dresses, her books, the small items that had made their cabin a home. At the bottom of an old trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, he found Clara's journal. His hands trembled as he lifted it out. The leather cover had darkened with age, and pressed flowers, columbine, and Indian paintbrush were tucked inside the pages. He couldn't remember the last time he'd looked at this. Maybe never. Maybe the pain had been too fresh when she died, and then later he'd simply walled it off with everything else he couldn't bear to feel. Now, with Echo sleeping peacefully by the fire and his own future uncertain, he opened it. Clara's handwriting flowed across the pages, elegant and certain. The entries started from their courtship, full of hope and plans. He read about the first time she'd seen him at that barn dance, how she'd known immediately he was different from other men, quieter, watching more than talking, but when he smiled it was like sunrise. He turned pages, reading about their wedding, their first year together, the struggles and joys of building a life from nothing. Then he found the entries from her pregnancy, and his throat tightened. "Silas is so careful with me," she'd written. "Almost too careful, as if I might break. He doesn't understand that I've never felt stronger. We're creating life together, and I can see in his eyes he's already imagining our child, teaching them to ride, passing on his father's stories, showing them how to read the land. He'll be such a good father. He has such gentleness in him, but he hides it away, afraid it makes him weak." Silas had to stop reading, press his palm against his eyes. She'd seen through him so completely. The next entry made his chest ache. "I worry sometimes about what happens if things go wrong. Not for me, I'm not afraid of death, but for Silas. He loves so deeply, but he's so afraid of that depth. If I'm not here to remind him, will he remember that his softness is his greatest strength? Will he close himself off completely, thinking isolation is safer than connection?" She'd written this just weeks before the birth, before everything went wrong, as if she'd known somehow what was coming. The final entry was dated the day before she went into labor. "Whatever happens, I need Silas to know this. The world needs men who can be both strong and tender. Men who will kneel in the dirt to help something helpless, who will choose mercy over convenience, who will protect the vulnerable even when it's easier not to. That's who Silas is, underneath the walls he's built. When I'm gone, if I'm gone, I hope he doesn't close his heart completely. I hope something or someone comes along to remind him who he really is. I hope he finds his way back to caring, because a man who stops caring stops living. And Silas deserves to truly live. The words blurred as tears finally came. 15 years of tears he'd held back, convinced that feeling them would break something in him that couldn't be repaired. But sitting there with Clara's journal open and her words speaking directly to his heart, Silas understood something fundamental. This journey with Echo wasn't just about saving a wolf pup. It was about becoming the man Clara had believed he could be. The man who would kneel in the dirt to help something helpless. The man who would choose mercy over convenience. The man who would protect the vulnerable even when it was easier, safer not to. Echo had given him back his ability to care, yes. But more than that, she'd given him a chance to prove to himself that Clara's faith hadn't been misplaced, that he could be strong and tender, that he could love without guarantees and still survive whatever came. You were right, he whispered to the empty air, to Clara's memory. You were right about everything. Echo, stirred by the fire, sensing his distress, and came to press her head against his knee. He stroked her fur, feeling her solid warmth, her absolute trust. Sudden noise outside shattered the moment. Horses, multiple riders, the sound of men's voices raised and angry. Silas's blood went cold. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. Torches, at least 6 men on horseback, and leading them was Garrett Bowen, his face twisted with determination and rage. "Come out, Boone!" Garrett shouted. "We're not waiting for tomorrow's vote. Time to finish this tonight!" Silas's mind raced. The meeting wasn't until tomorrow. Sheriff Riddick wouldn't even know about this until it was over. Garrett had chosen tonight specifically for that reason. No law to stop him, no witnesses to intervene. He looked at Echo, who had her hackles raised and was growling low. This was it. The confrontation he'd been dreading. "Echo, listen to me." He knelt beside her, hands on either side of her face. "I need you to run. Use the whistle path. Go to the hills. Find your pack," Echo whined, unwilling. "Go!" He commanded more forcefully, hating the fear in his voice, but knowing her safety mattered more than his pride. "Run now!" For a moment she hesitated. Then she bolted through the back door he'd opened, disappearing into the darkness beyond the torchlight. Silas stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand, but pointed down. Garrett and his men had spread out, surrounding the homestead. One of them threw a torch toward the barn. It landed in dry grass, and flames caught immediately. "Your barn or your wolf," Garrett called. "One of them burns tonight. Your choice." "She's gone," Silas said, keeping his voice steady despite the fury building in his chest. "You've got no cause to be here." "No cause? You brought predators to our territory. You put every family at risk." "That's cause enough. I brought nothing. I saved a pup that would have died, and I've proven the mountain lion I don't care about your evidence." Garrett's horse danced sideways, responding to his rider's agitation. "This is about keeping our land safe. And if you won't do what's necessary, we will." Another torch flew, this time toward Silas's cabin. It hit the porch rail and caught. Flames spread quickly on the dry wood. Silas raised his rifle. "You burn my home, Garrett, and there'll be consequences." "You going to shoot us all? 1 man against 6? The situation was spiraling beyond control. Silas could see it in Garrett's eyes. The man had worked himself into a state where violence felt justified, where fear had twisted into something darker. Men like this were dangerous because they'd convinced themselves they were righteous. Then, from the darkness beyond the torchlight came a sound that froze everyone in place. Howling, multiple wolves. Close and getting closer. They emerged from the night like ghosts made solid, 8 wolves moving in perfect coordination, surrounding the homestead just as Garrett's men had surrounded it. The she-wolf who'd trusted Silas with her pup stood at the front, her eyes reflecting torchlight, her stance protective, and beside her, having not run to safety, but having run to bring help, was Echo. She positioned herself at the she-wolf's shoulder, and even in the chaos, Silas felt a surge of pride. She'd understood. She'd gone not to save herself, but to bring her family to save him. Garrett's men panicked. Horses reared, torches dropped. One man fired his rifle into the air, which only made things worse. The wolves didn't attack, just held their ground, but their presence, wild and powerful and utterly outside human control, transformed the confrontation. "Stand down!" Sheriff Riddick's voice cut through the chaos. He rode in hard, pistol drawn, Doc Harlan and Martha Crenshaw behind him. "Garrett, you and your men lower your weapons right now! They're protecting him!" Garrett shouted, pointing at the wolves. "You see? He's in league with them." "What I see," Tom said coldly, "is attempted arson and vigilante violence. What I see is you breaking the law you're claiming to uphold." Martha rode closer to Silas. "We heard what Garrett was planning. Rode as fast as we could." The she-wolf moved then, approaching Silas with Echo at her side. They stood together, man and two wolves, in a statement of alliance that couldn't be mistaken. The pack had chosen to protect him. Echo had chosen to return and fight rather than run. "This is unnatural," Garrett said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "No," Silas said quietly. "This is trust. This is what happens when you choose mercy over fear." The wolves held their position until Garrett and his men retreated, defeated and shaken. Then, with a last look at Silas and Echo, the pack melted back into darkness. The she-wolf touched noses with Echo once, a blessing, a farewell, a reminder, then was gone. Silas extinguished the fires Garrett had started, the damage minimal but real. Tom arrested two of Garrett's men who'd actually thrown torches, let the others go with warnings. The crisis had passed, but everything had changed. Martha approached as the others dispersed. "That was something," she said softly. "They came to protect you. Both of you." Silas nodded, still processing. "They trusted me with Echo. Tonight, they honored that trust. And you honored theirs by not giving up on her." She patted his arm. "Clara would be proud of you, Silas. You became the man she knew you could be." After everyone left, Silas sat on his porch with Echo at his side, watching the stars and thinking about Clara's journal. About trust and mercy, and the courage it took to care deeply in a world that often punished such caring. Echo leaned against him, and in the distance, her birth family howled, a song of wildness and connection, of things larger than fear or hatred. Silas had his answer now. Whatever tomorrow's vote brought, he'd proven something to himself. He'd become the man who would kneel in the dirt to help something helpless. The man who would choose mercy over convenience. The man who would protect the vulnerable, even when it was dangerous to do so. Clara had been right about him all along. He just had to remember it. Morning came grey and cold, the kind of day that promised snow by evening. Silas barely slept, his mind replaying the night's events. Garrett's attempted violence, the pack's intervention, Echo's choice to return and fight rather than flee. The town would be talking about nothing else. Stories already growing larger with each retelling. By the time full light arrived, 3 riders had already passed his homestead, heading toward Bitter Creek. Word was spreading fast. The emergency meeting that was supposed to happen today would be packed, the atmosphere charged with fear and wonder in equal measure. Silas prepared carefully. He washed, shaved, put on his best shirt, the one Clara had sewn for him years ago, still serviceable despite its age. He gathered his evidence, samples of mountain lion fur, detailed sketches of paw prints, written documentation of the kill patterns. He tucked his father's compass into his vest pocket, feeling its weight settle against his chest. And after a moment's hesitation, he wrapped Clara's journal in oilcloth and placed it carefully in his saddlebag. Echo watched him with intelligent amber eyes, sensing something significant was happening. She'd been subdued since last night, perhaps understanding how close they'd come to violence, how tenuous their position remained. "I have to go to town," Silas told her, kneeling to meet her gaze. "Have to speak to people, try to make them understand." Echo pressed her head against his chest, and he held her there for a long moment, breathing in the wild scent of her fur. feeling her heartbeat steady and strong. "You need to stay here," he said, pulling back. "This is going to be difficult enough without you there to frighten people." Echo whined, clearly wanting to come. "I know, but I need you to trust me on this." He pulled out the cedar whistle, let her see it. "You stay here within hearing range. If I need you, I'll call, but only if I need you. Understand?" She licked his hand once, then settled onto the porch, resignation in every line of her body. The ride to Bitter Creek felt longer than usual. Silas kept checking behind him, making sure Echo hadn't followed. But she remained where he'd left her, visible on the horizon, watching. The sight both comforted and worried him. What if the meeting went poorly? What if he couldn't convince them? Echo would be vulnerable, alone at the homestead, if vigilantes decided to take matters into their own hands. He pushed the thought away, had to focus on what he could control, his words, his evidence, his testimony. The church was already packed when he arrived, people spilling out onto the steps despite the cold. Every rancher in the territory seemed to be present, along with townsfolk who normally avoided community gatherings. Silas tied Russ to a post and walked through the crowd, feeling hostile eyes track his movement. Inside, benches were crammed full. The air was thick with body heat and tension. Sheriff Riddick stood at the front with Doc Harlan and Martha, who'd positioned herself strategically where she could watch the crowd and support Silas with her presence. Garrett Bowen sat in the front row, surrounded by his supporters, radiating self-righteous anger, despite having been caught attempting arson just hours ago. Tom called for order, his voice cutting through the murmur. "We're here to address the situation with Silas Boone and the wolf he's been keeping. Last night's events have made it clear we can't wait any longer for a decision. Last night proved Boone's dangerous." Someone shouted from the back. "Last night proved Garrett Bowen's dangerous," Martha countered sharply. "He tried to burn a man's home." Arguments erupted, voices overlapping. Tom slammed his hand on the pulpit. "Everyone will get their say, but in order. Garrett, you first." Garrett stood, playing to the crowd with practiced ease. He recounted the death of his bull, painted Echo as a threat waiting to happen, described the pack's appearance as evidence that Silas had somehow allied with dangerous predators. His voice rose with passion, fear-mongering wrapped in concern for community safety. "We have families here," Garrett finished. "Children. We can't risk their safety because one man's decided he'd rather live with wolves than people." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Silas felt his chances slipping, fear winning over reason like it so often did. Tom gestured to Silas. "Your turn." Silas stood, and the church fell silent. He walked to the front, set his evidence on the pulpit, and faced the community that would decide Echo's fate. His hands were steady, his voice calm, but his heart pounded. "Most of you know me," he began. "Know I've lived outside Bitter Creek for 20 years. Know I keep to myself, help when asked, don't cause trouble. Some of you think that makes me strange. Maybe you're right." He paused, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "A few months back, I found a wolf giving birth alone in a gulch. She was dying. Her pups were dying. I could have left them, probably should have by most folks' reckoning. But I didn't." He described the birth in simple terms, leaving out nothing, the stillborn pup, the living ones, the mother's exhaustion. "I helped because it was the right thing to do. Because something was suffering and I had the skill to ease that suffering." "That was your first mistake," Garrett interjected. "Maybe, but 3 days later that wolf returned with her pack. They left the smallest pup at my door, too weak to survive in the wild, needing care the pack couldn't provide. They trusted me with one of their own." He let that sink in, then continued. "I named her Echo. I've raised her with respect for what she is. Not a pet, not a dog, but a wild creature who's chosen to live alongside me. And in these months, she's taught me something I'd forgotten." Silas pulled out Clara's journal, unwrapped it carefully. His voice roughened. "My wife died 15 years ago. Died in childbirth, along with our daughter. I survived it by closing myself off, convincing myself that caring too much led only to pain. I stopped living and started just existing." He opened the journal, found the passage he'd marked. "Clara wrote this before she died. The world needs men who can be both strong and tender. Men who will kneel in the dirt to help something helpless, who will choose mercy over convenience, who will protect the vulnerable even when it's easier not to. That's who Silas is underneath the walls he's built. His voice broke, but he pushed through. She was wrong about me then. I became exactly what she feared, a man who chose isolation over connection, safety over risk. But Echo gave me a chance to become the man Clara believed in. Every day with her has been about learning to care again, to trust again, to protect something vulnerable even when it's difficult. He set the journal down and picked up his evidence. Garrett's bull was killed by a mountain lion, not Echo. I have proof, fur samples, paw prints that don't match wolf patterns, evidence of the lion's hunting territory. Echo was with me the night of the kill, never left my property. She's innocent. He spread the evidence on the pulpit. But this isn't really about evidence, is it? It's about fear. Fear of things we don't understand. Fear of wildness we can't control. I understand that fear. I've lived with it for 15 years. Fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of caring too much. Silas looked directly at Garrett. But I've learned that fear makes us destroy what we don't understand. It makes us choose violence over patience, hatred over mercy. If we kill Echo because we're afraid of what she might do, we lose something essential. We lose our humanity. He pulled out his father's compass, held it up. My father gave me this before he died. Told me it would always point to true north, not the easy direction, but the right one. True north isn't killing a creature because we're afraid. True north is choosing to trust, to show mercy, to protect the vulnerable even when it costs us something. The silence in the church was absolute. Silas set the compass down beside the journal and the evidence. Echo has never threatened anyone, never harmed livestock, never shown aggression except in defense. The pack that appeared last night wasn't attacking, they were protecting. Wolves understand loyalty and family in ways we've forgotten. They chose to trust me with one of their own. Are we so afraid that we can't honor that trust? He stepped back. I'm asking you to vote with courage instead of fear. Give Echo a chance. If she ever does cause harm, I'll accept full responsibility. But don't kill her for crimes she hasn't committed and might never commit. Martha stood immediately. I've watched Silas with that wolf for months. I've seen nothing but gentleness and care. Echo's as much a part of this community as any of us, and she's earned the right to stay. She's a predator, someone called out. So are we, Martha shot back. The question is whether we're going to act like thoughtless predators or like people with conscience and mercy. Doc Harlan rose slowly, surprising everyone. I'll admit I had my doubts. Still do, truth be told. But in 3 months, Echo's been examined by me twice, interacted with dozens of people, and shown zero aggression. Every medical test says she's healthy, well cared for, and under Silas's control. As a man of science, I have to acknowledge the evidence. Sheriff Riddick reached up, unpinned his badge, and set it deliberately on the pulpit beside Silas's compass. The gesture sent a ripple through the crowd. Speaking as Tom, not as sheriff, he said clearly, I've known Silas for 20 years. He's one of the most decent men I've ever met. If he vouches for Echo, that carries weight with me. More weight than fear and speculation. The room split visibly, some nodding agreement, others shaking their heads. Then a young woman stood, holding a child of perhaps 3 years. Silas recognized her, Jenny Marshall, a widow struggling to keep her small farm running. 3 months ago, she said, voice trembling but determined, my boy fell through creek ice. I was at market, didn't know he'd wandered off. Silas found him, pulled him out, brought him home and sat with him until he stopped shaking. Didn't ask for thanks, didn't expect payment. Just did it because it needed doing. An older rancher stood. Silas helped me birth a breech calf last spring. Worked 3 hours in the cold, saved both mother and calf. Never charged me a penny. Another voice. He rebuilt my fence after the storm, knowing I couldn't afford to hire help. One by one, people stood and shared stories, small acts of kindness, moments of help freely given, proof that the solitary man they'd thought they knew had been quietly caring for their community all along. Garrett's face grew redder with each testimony, but he couldn't deny what everyone was hearing. that Silas Boone had earned trust through years of steady, selfless action. Finally, Tom called for the vote. All in favor of allowing Echo to remain with Silas under his full responsibility and supervision, raise your hands. Silas held his breath. Hands rose throughout the church, not all of them, not even most at first, but more than half. Slowly, grudgingly, but enough. Motion carries, Tom announced. Echo stays with conditions. Silas, you're legally responsible for any harm she causes. Any aggression, any livestock kills, any danger to people, you answer for it. Understood? Understood, Silas said, voice rough with relief. This is a mistake. Garrett stood, shaking with fury. You're all fools. That thing will turn on you, mark my words. And when it does, don't come crying to me. He stormed out, 3 of his men following. The others stayed, the decision made even if not unanimously accepted. Martha hugged Silas fiercely. You did it. You actually did it. We did it, he corrected. All of us. People approached to shake his hand, offer congratulations or at least acceptance. The tension had broken, though Silas knew Garrett's anger would remain a problem. Men like that didn't forget perceived slights. But for now, Echo was safe. The vote had been cast, the decision made. Silas could go home and tell her they'd won. The ride back felt lighter despite Garrett's parting threat. The sun broke through clouds, turning the landscape gold. And there, at the property line, Echo waited. The moment she saw him, she ran, bounding through sage with unmistakable joy. Silas dismounted and knelt, and Echo slammed into him with enough force to knock him backward. She licked his face, whined, danced around him, pure celebration of his return. We did it, he told her, laughing for the first time in weeks. You can stay. You're safe, Echo howled, the sound echoing across empty country, and from far away her birth pack answered, a chorus of voices celebrating with them. But as Silas stood and looked toward town, he saw riders in the distance, Garrett's men watching. The threat wasn't over. Not yet. Still, they had today. They had this moment. And sometimes that had to be enough. 2 nights of uneasy peace followed the vote. Silas couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, pressure accumulating like storm clouds on a summer horizon. He found himself checking the perimeter of his property constantly, rifle always within reach. Sleep coming in shallow fragments, Echo sensed his tension and reflected it back. Pacing the cabin at odd hours, ears swiveling toward sounds Silas couldn't hear. She'd grown into her full size now. Nearly 90 pounds of muscle and wild intelligence. When she stood beside him, her shoulder came to his hip, and her amber eyes held a depth that sometimes unsettled him with how much she seemed to understand. The second night, Silas tried to settle into his chair by the fire, but rest wouldn't come. He cleaned his rifle, oiled the mechanism, checked his ammunition. Practical tasks to keep his hands busy, while his mind worked through scenarios he didn't want to imagine. Around midnight, Echo's low growl brought him instantly alert. She stood at the door, hackles raised, focused on something outside. Silas moved to the window, keeping to the shadows, and felt his stomach drop. Riders, at least 8, maybe more, approaching from multiple directions with the clear intention of surrounding his homestead. And leading them, even in darkness, Silas recognized Garrett Bowen's silhouette. They'd come at night deliberately. Sheriff Riddick would be at home, unaware. The town was asleep. No witnesses, no law to intervene. Just Garrett and men who'd decided the vote didn't matter, that their fear outweighed community decision. Silas Boone. Garrett's voice carried across the cold air. We gave you your chance, gave that beast a chance. But we're done waiting for disaster. Silas grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, Echo at his side. The town voted. The matter's settled. The town was wrong. Garrett dismounted and his men spread out in a careful perimeter. Several held torches, the flames dancing in the darkness. We've got families to protect, cattle to safeguard. Your wolf's a danger and we're ending it tonight. Echo's done nothing. She doesn't have to. She's a wolf. That's enough. One of Garrett's men raised a torch and Silas saw the intent written plain. They weren't here for discussion. They'd come to destroy Echo, his homestead, whatever it took to remove the threat they'd convinced themselves existed. Last chance, Boone. Garrett said. Send the wolf out or we burn you out. Silas's mind raced through options. He was outnumbered, outgunned. He could hold them off for a while. But against 8 men with torches and rifles, the outcome was inevitable. Unless he looked at Echo and his heart broke at what he had to do. Go, he told her quietly, urgently. Use the whistle path. Find your pack. Run, Echo, run now. Echo whined, pressing against his leg, unwilling to abandon him. Please. His voice cracked. I need you safe. Go! But Echo held her ground. And Silas saw the stubborn loyalty in her eyes, the same loyalty that had brought her back with the pack before, the same loyalty that defined wolves more than any human fully understood. Before he could command her again, one of Garrett's men hurled his torch. It arced through the air and landed in the dry grass near the barn. Flames caught immediately, spreading fast. Your barn burns, Garrett called. Then your cabin. Then whatever's left. Your choice stops mattering now. Another torch flew, landing closer to the cabin. Silas raised his rifle, but even as he did, he knew the futility. He couldn't shoot them all, and violence would only prove Garrett's point, that he'd chosen a wolf over community. Danger over safety. I won't let you do this, Silas said. But his words felt hollow against the crackling flames. Garrett drew his own rifle, leveling it at Echo. Then you'll watch her die. The moment stretched, unbearable. Silas moved to shield Echo, knowing it would cost him everything, but unable to do anything else. This was who he was, the man who would protect the vulnerable even when it meant his own destruction. Clara had been right about that. Then, cutting through the tension like a blade, a sound rose from the darkness beyond the torchlight. Howling, not one wolf but many, their voices joining in a chorus that raised the hair on every human neck. The pack emerged from the night like spirits taking form. 8 wolves moved with eerie coordination, appearing on the ridges above the homestead, at the edges of firelight, surrounding Garrett's men just as they had surrounded Silas. The she-wolf, Echo's mother, stood at the front, her coat gleaming in the flickering torch flames. Her eyes found Silas, then Echo, and something passed between them. Recognition, alliance, choice. Garrett's horse reared, nearly throwing him. His men's horses danced sideways, snorting with fear. One man fired his rifle into the air, the sound explosive in the cold night, and the pack surged forward a few steps before stopping. A warning, not an attack. They're protecting him, someone shouted, voice high with panic. Get back to the horses! Another yelled, but Garrett held his ground, rifle still aimed at Echo, even as his hands shook. I don't care how many wolves you've got. That thing dies tonight. Then Echo did something extraordinary. She stepped away from Silas, positioning herself between him and Garrett. Her hackles were raised, teeth bared, every line of her body radiating protective fury. But she didn't attack. She stood her ground, a living barrier between threat and pack. The she-wolf howled again, and the pack answered. 8 wolves calling across the darkness, their voices speaking of things older than towns and fences, of loyalty and family and bonds that transcended species. And in that moment, with flames spreading and rifles raised and fear thick enough to taste, Silas understood what the wolves were teaching all of them. That courage wasn't the absence of fear. That family was who stood beside you when everything went wrong. That some truths were too profound for words and could only be spoken in the language of absolute trust. Echo had returned with her family, not because she was a threat, but because she was exactly what Silas had always claimed, a bridge between worlds. Proof that wildness and civilization could coexist if only humans had the courage to allow it. The question was whether Garrett and his men had that courage, or whether fear would win as it so often did, turning the night to tragedy and proving that some lessons came too late for learning. The standoff held like a held breath, men with rifles and torches on one side, wolves with teeth and ancient authority on the other, and in the middle, a spreading fire that cared nothing for the conflict it illuminated. Smoke rose into the cold night air, sparks dancing upward toward indifferent stars. Call them off, Boone. Garrett's voice cracked with strain. Call them off or we start shooting. They're not mine to call, Silas said, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. They're protecting one of their own. That's what family does. That's what monsters do. One of Garrett's men, younger than the rest and clearly terrified, fired his rifle into the air. The sound cracked through the night, and the wolves surged forward 3 steps, 8 sets of teeth bared, 8 bodies coiled for action. Chaos erupted, horses rearing, men shouting, torches dropping. Another rifle fired, this time deliberately at the wolves, but the shot went wide. The pack split, flanking on both sides, and Silas saw strategy in their movement, coordination that spoke of intelligence and purpose. "Stop!" Silas raised both hands, rifle forgotten. "Everyone stop right now." Something in his voice cut through the panic. Men froze mid-motion. Wolves held their ground, watching. Even the fire seemed to pause in its spreading, though that was likely Silas's imagination. He turned to Garrett, who still had his rifle aimed at Echo. "This is fear talking, Garrett. Fear of what you don't understand. Fear of losing control. Fear of admitting you might be wrong. I know about fear. I lived with it for 15 years, let it hollow me out until I was barely human. Don't you dare. But fear makes us destroy what could save us. It makes us choose violence when patience would serve better. You're so afraid of what Echo might do that you can't see what she is. A creature capable of loyalty and protection and trust beyond what most humans manage." Garrett's hands shook on the rifle, and for a moment Silas thought he might actually pull the trigger. Then Garrett shifted his aim slightly, pointing the rifle directly at Silas instead. "Get out of the way." "No, I will shoot you. Boone, I will shoot you to get to that wolf. Then you'll have to." Silas stood his ground, directly between the rifle and Echo. "Because I'm done running from caring. I'm done letting fear win. You want to kill her, you go through me first." The moment crystallized, sharp and clear as breaking ice. Garrett's finger on the trigger. Silas standing firm. Echo behind him, pack surrounding them, fire spreading. All the elements of tragedy aligned. Then the she-wolf did something that changed everything. She threw back her head and howled, not a warning or threat, but something else entirely. A song of profound sadness and beauty, rising into the cold night like prayer. One by one, the pack took up the call. 8 voices joining in harmony, creating something that transcended mere animal sound. It spoke of wilderness and survival, of family bonds and ancient wisdom, of things that existed before humans drew lines on maps and claimed ownership of land that had always been free. And Echo, standing behind Silas, added her voice to theirs. Her howl blended with her birth family's song, and in that blending, Silas heard everything she was, wild and tame, free and loyal, belonging to 2 worlds and bridging both. The sound moved through the assembled humans like wind through grass. Even Garrett's men lowered their rifles slightly, transfixed. The wolves weren't threatening. They were claiming Silas's pack, declaring Echo's place in both families, announcing that some bonds transcended species and understanding. Garrett's rifle wavered, then slowly, so slowly, began to lower. Into this profound moment, new sounds intruded. Hoofbeats, voices calling, the blessed appearance of Sheriff Tom Riddick riding hard with Martha Crenshaw, Doc Harlan and a dozen townsfolk behind them, Garrett Bowen. Tom's voice carried absolute authority. "You lower that weapon right now, or I'll arrest you where you stand." The spell broke. Garrett's men began backing toward their horses, the fight draining out of them. Garrett himself stood frozen, rifle now pointed at the ground, face twisted with emotions Silas couldn't name, rage and fear, and perhaps something like wonder at what he'd just witnessed. "It's over, Garrett," Tom said, dismounting. "Stand down." For a long moment, Garrett didn't move. Then, with visible effort, he uncocked his rifle. "This ain't finished, Boone. That thing will turn on you eventually, and when it does, I'll take responsibility," Silas interrupted quietly. "But it won't, because trust works both ways, and she knows I'll never betray mine." Garrett climbed onto his horse, his men following suit. As they rode away, he called back, "You're a fool." "You'll see." But his voice lacked conviction, and everyone heard it. The townsfolk moved immediately to fight the spreading fire. Martha organized bucket lines from the well. Doc Harlan beat out flames with a blanket. Others shoveled dirt. The wolves watched from the edges of firelight, no longer threatening, just present. When the immediate danger had passed and the fires were mostly extinguished, Silas approached the she-wolf. She watched him come, alert but calm. He extended his hand slowly, and after a moment's consideration, she allowed him to touch her head, rough fur beneath his palm. Warmth and wildness and trust all mixed together. "Thank you," he said simply. She held his gaze, and in her amber eyes Silas saw acknowledgement. A debt repaid, a trust honored. Then she backed away, rejoining her pack. Echo stood between Silas and the pack, torn. She looked at her birth family, then at Silas, then back again. Her whole body vibrated with indecision, wild instinct pulling one direction, chosen loyalty pulling another. Silas understood what this moment meant. He pulled out the cedar whistle, held it up so Echo could see, then blew one clear note. Not a command, an offering. "Your choice, Echo," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Always your choice. If you need to go with them, I understand. If you want to stay, I'll be here. But it's your decision." Echo went to the pack first. She touched noses with the she-wolf in a gesture of love and respect and farewell. The other wolves pressed close, family acknowledging family. For a heartbeat, Silas thought she might leave with them, and he prepared himself for that loss. Then Echo turned and bounded back to him, pressing her entire body against his legs, tail wagging, making her choice unmistakably clear. This was home. This was pack. This was where she belonged. The she-wolf watched for a moment longer, then turned and led the pack into darkness. They melted away like smoke, leaving only the memory of their presence and the lingering sound of their howling. Silas sank down onto the cold ground, and Echo climbed into his lap despite her size, licking his face, whining with relief and happiness. He held her and let tears come, for Clara, for all the years of isolation, for the miracle of second chances and the profound gift of being chosen by something wild. Martha sat beside them, put her hand on Silas's shoulder. "You did it. You really did it." "She did it," Silas corrected, his face buried in Echo's fur. "She chose to trust, and that changed everything." Around them, the community worked to salvage what the fire had damaged. The barn would need repairs. Some fencing was gone, but the cabin stood intact, and so did the life Silas had built within it. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the last of the townsfolk prepared to leave. Tom approached, looking exhausted but satisfied. "Garrett won't trouble you again," he said. "Not after tonight." "Too many witnesses to what really happened, and what did happen?" Silas asked. Tom smiled slightly. "Something I'll be telling my grandchildren about." The night the wolves chose sides, and fear lost its grip on decent people. He rode away, and Silas stood alone with Echo in the grey pre-dawn light. The cedar whistle hung around his neck. The compass rested in his pocket, still pointing true north. Clara's journal waited inside, her words proven right. Echo nudged his hand, and Silas looked down at her, this wild creature who'd chosen him, this bridge between worlds, this second chance at living fully. "Come on, girl," he said. "Let's go home." They walked toward the cabin together, and behind them, faint on the morning wind, came one last howl, the pack's farewell and blessing combined. Echo's ears perked up, but she didn't turn back. She'd made her choice, and that made all the difference. Spring arrived with wildflowers and birdsong, transforming the harsh Wyoming landscape into something gentler. 3 months had passed since that confrontation in firelight, and in that time everything had shifted in ways both visible and profound. Silas's homestead stood rebuilt, stronger than before. The community had rallied. Men who'd once viewed him with suspicion now worked alongside him to restore the fire-damaged barn. New fencing stretched across his property, boards straight and true. Even Garrett, keeping his distance but no longer openly hostile, had sent lumber with a terse note saying only, "For repairs." The work had transformed more than just buildings. Silas found himself welcomed in town with genuine warmth. Martha's general store became a place where he lingered for conversation, rather than rushing through transactions. Doc Harlan greeted him by name and asked after Echo without the old disapproval. Children waved when they saw him riding past, Fearless now that they'd heard the story of the wolf who'd chosen love over wildness, Echo herself had reached full maturity, nearly 100 pounds of muscle and grace, her grey-silver coat gleaming with health. She moved with the fluid power of wild things, but her amber eyes held intelligence and devotion that made her something more than wolf, something beyond simple classification. She was Echo, neither wholly tame nor fully wild, but perfectly herself. Their morning routine had become ritual. Silas would wake to find Echo already alert, waiting by the door. They'd step out together into the cool dawn, and he'd blow the cedar whistle once. Not a command, but a greeting, an acknowledgement of their bond. She'd race across the property, checking boundaries, hunting rabbits when the mood struck, but always circling back to him. Twice in the past months, Echo had disappeared for days, following the call of her birth pack. Each time Silas had felt the old fear creep in, that she'd finally chosen the wild permanently. But each time she'd returned, pressing against his legs, bringing him gifts of successful hunts, reaffirming her choice. She belonged to both worlds now, bridging them with natural grace. Martha visited on a bright April morning, her wagon loaded with supplies and her smile wide. "Brought you fresh bread," she called, climbing down with a basket. "And news. Doc Harlan's spreading word that your methods with Echo could teach people about respectful animal training. Want you to speak at the next town meeting." Silas accepted the bread, warm in his hands. "I'm no teacher, Martha. You taught a whole town about courage and trust." "I'd say that qualifies." She patted Echo, who'd come to investigate. "Besides, this beautiful girl is proof your methods work." Not an hour later, Doc Harlan himself appeared, ostensibly to check on Echo, but really to apologize again. "I was wrong," he said, not for the first time. "Set in my thinking, couldn't see past what I expected to what actually was. Sometimes old dogs need to learn new tricks, or in this case learn from wolves." They shared coffee while Echo dozed in the spring sunshine, and the conversation ranged from animal behavior to life philosophy. When Doc Harlan left, he clasped Silas's hand warmly, and Silas recognized the gesture for what it was: acceptance into community, erasure of old distances. The afternoon brought Sheriff Riddick, but he wasn't alone. A stranger rode beside him, older than Silas by a few years, with familiar features that made Silas's breath catch. "James?" His brother dismounted slowly, face uncertain. "Got your letter. Took me a while to work up courage to come, but Martha wrote and said I'd regret it if I didn't. You mailed it." Silas turned to where Tom sat his horse, smiling. "Martha found it, actually," Tom admitted. "Figured you'd written it for a reason, even if you'd lost your nerve to send it." James approached cautiously, and for a moment the brothers just looked at each other, years of estrangement and pride and hurt feelings hanging between them. Then James pulled something from his pocket and held it out. "Pa's watch stopped keeping time after you left," James said. "Felt wrong, like time had stopped for our family. I got this for you, new one that works. Figured maybe it could mean starting fresh." Silas took the pocket watch, silver and bright, and opened it. The hands moved steadily, ticking off seconds with quiet certainty. His throat tightened. "James, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just let me meet this wolf that brought you back to living." Echo approached James carefully, reading the emotional weight of the moment, and after initial wariness, accepted him with gentle grace. The brothers spent the afternoon talking, really talking, for the first time in 20 years. Old wounds aired and healed, apologies given and accepted, stories shared about the decades they'd lost. By evening, Tom had left, and James had agreed to stay a few days before returning to Montana. "You should come visit," James said. "Meet my grandchildren. They'd love hearing about Echo." "I'd like that," Silas said, and meant it. As sunset painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, Silas sat on his porch with Echo at his side. The land stretched before them, familiar but transformed, no longer a landscape of isolation, but of connection, of possibility, of home. From distant hills came howling, and Echo's ears perked up. She answered, her voice joining her birth family's song across the cooling air. Silas listened to the conversation, understanding none of the specifics, but feeling the essence. Family acknowledging family, while checking on one of their own who'd chosen a different path. When the howling faded, Silas pulled out Clara's journal, worn now from frequent reading. He found his favorite passage and read it aloud, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. The world needs men who can be both strong and tender. Men who will kneel in the dirt to help something helpless, who will choose mercy over convenience, who will protect the vulnerable even when it's easier not to. He closed the journal and looked at Echo. You were right, Clara, about everything. Took me long enough to figure it out. Echo rested her head on his lap, amber eyes reflecting the last light. In that moment, Silas understood the full arc of his journey, from the hollow man who'd found a struggling wolf to the whole man who'd been chosen by wildness and community both. The new watch in his pocket ticked steadily. Time moving forward now, not frozen in grief, but flowing toward futures he could barely imagine. His brother sleeping inside, plans for visits and reconnection. A wolf at his side who taught him that love didn't require certainty, only courage. A town that had learned to trust what they didn't fully understand. Echo brought him a rabbit from her evening hunt, laid it at his feet with obvious pride, tail wagging. Silas felt his eyes sting with tears he no longer tried to hide. Good girl. That's very good. Stars emerged, pricking the darkening sky. Another day ending, another beginning waiting. Silas spoke into the quiet words for Echo and Clara and himself. We did good, didn't we? Echo's tail thumped agreement against the worn porch boards. Some bonds transcended logic and species. Some choices defined who you became rather than who you'd been. Silas Boone was no longer just a solitary cowboy or a drifter or a man frozen in grief. He was a man chosen by the wild, yes, but more importantly, a man who'd chosen to care again, to trust again, to live fully despite knowing that everything beloved could be lost. That made him the man Clara had believed in, the man his father had raised, the man his brother could return to, the man his community respected and welcomed. Most importantly, he'd become himself again, whole and present and open to whatever came next. Time for supper, he said, standing. Come on, girl. They went inside together, closing the door on another day of this transformed life. Outside, the wind carried one last howl, blessing and farewell combined. Inside, a man and wolf settled into evening routines, and time moved forward at its steady pace. No longer frozen, no longer wasted, just time. Precious and finite and fully lived,